Hello and welcome to my first patron-only episode. If you're listening to this, I want to personally thank you for supporting me and my Patreon. We can expect for patron-only episodes going forwards. What I'm planning on doing is talking about topics that are more wide-ranging than my normal YouTube content with my friends and A Song of Ice and Fire luminaries.
Oh my god.
This first one will be at the topic of Cripples, Bastards, and Broken Things as a larger theme of the books and how this informs the creation of the others and their relationship to humans and the children. These will be available for $5 and up patrons going forwards. Joining me for this very special first episode is the Song of Ice and Fire luminary.
I'm quitting.
Luminary. And fellow Maester Monthly co-host, the Aegon to my Visenya, Eliana.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here for your first patron-only episode, and thanks to everyone for supporting my Visenya. Matt, as you all know, there's like Michael, Matt, and I frequently host the Maester Monthly podcast where we talk about the different topics or news, things that are being discussed on the Song of Ice and Fire subreddit as moderators of the subreddit. And you know, we are the Three Heads of the Dragon. We decided this somehow, randomly, drunkenly, as many of our podcasts go, that I was, I guess, Aegon the Conqueror, and we were like, yes, Matt and Michael are my sister wives, and Matt, being the elder, was Visenya, and Michael being so musical and
alive with light.
Alive with light was obviously our Rhaenys.
It makes sense. We decided to have a fun gender swap of the original Targaryen triad, and it actually seems to work out quite a bit, which is interesting. And you come from, obviously, Girls Gone Canon.
Yes, I do. So, together with Chloe, also known as Queen of Love and Booty, on Twitter, or Lies in Arbor Gold, depending on which handle you know her by. We do a reread podcast, as many do, but ours is actually following the story through each POV, so it's a very much more character-centric podcast. And it's been a really interesting journey. Honestly, every time I'm still like, I'm surprised no one was doing this as a podcast because so many people reread the books this way by following one character at a time, and it is something that I think is integral to understanding A Song of Ice and Fire by really understanding the characters and the different conflicts that they're facing.
I think that's true, especially with the way that George normally writes. He writes in terms of short stories or shorter arcs. Song of Ice and Fire is really just like a series of short stories that are related to each other, sort of knitted together in an interesting way, and it's a really clever idea for a podcast. Y'all should listen to Girls Gone Canon.
Yeah, we have a lot of fun doing that, and so right now we are going through Sansa chapters. We started out, you know, with everyone's dad, Ned. I thought that'd be a good starting place.
The Ned father.
Yeah, I mean, he's so important to how we all first came into the series and came to love it. And then after Ned, we covered Barristan and Quentyn and Arianne, and finally, yes, we are now at Sansa.
I'm surprised it isn't just the Sansa podcast, but you know,
it's
good
right
that
now.
you guys waited until you got there.
So it's kind of funny because you all know, I'm sure, that meme where there's the guy with the two women and like he's holding hands with one of them and he's like looking back at the other one. And we actually feel that sometimes, yes, it is a Sansa podcast, but for some reason we end up veering off and talking about Daenerys a lot.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, and I think part of it is because, of course, people ask us questions about certain things, and some of them are about Daenerys, and then next thing you know, here we are, 20 minutes later, still talking about Daenerys, and we're like, oh wait, we have an actual like podcast with a character that we're following, right? So let's talk about that.
That's true. Your relationship to Sansa and Daenerys is the same as Jeff and Emmett to Stannis, I would say, where somehow it all comes back to them. No matter what you're talking about, it will come back to them.
That's true, but I will never admit to them that I have something that is like my Stannis. to them. I don't want to put it in those terms, and I'm sure you don't either.
Well, apparently at some point I'll be going on there and talking about Renly and Stannis, and I'm sure I will have a lot of fun being told I am wrong. All right. So for this first episode, as I said, the title is Cripples, Bastards, and Broken Things, and we'll be talking about how those relate as a larger theme of A Song of Ice and Fire, and particularly, eventually we'll get to the others and the children and the humans and how it all relates together into one larger story. But to start off with, I thought we would start with the quote that inspired this. Your brother Jon asked it of me, and I have a tender spot in my heart for cripples, bastards, and broken things. Tyrion Lannister placed a hand over his heart and grinned. And when you look at a lot of the characters and the POVs and their arcs, George tends to follow those three things, cripples, bastards, and broken things, reimagined in different ways. And especially with the POVs, as we're going to go over, like, this is not just a small idea, it is a large overarching idea of A Song of Ice and Fire in general.
Mm-hmm. It definitely is. And throughout today we're going to talk about how that manifests throughout all of these different characters and their journey.
So why don't you introduce our first section? What are we talking about?
Yeah, so, we want to talk a little more about these themes that George R. R. Martin is exploring. And again, a lot of that comes through this idea of the cripples, bastards, and broken things, but I think a lot of it has to do with, again, that idea of brokenness. And George always loves to cite this quote by William Faulkner about the human heart in conflict with itself is the only thing worth writing about. And George tries to bring this into his works. Like, of course, yes, we have all these fantastical, magical elements, but part of what makes A Song of Ice and Fire so compelling is that it's rooted in these truths about the challenges that we as people face every day. It's just a matter of scale and how grandiose it is, but the idea of, being a bastard, who you are in your family, how your parents treat you, these things are universal.
Definitely hard to agree with that. It's also important that A Song of Ice and Fire, along with a lot of his other works, usually start with very simple, basic ideas. A lot of his previous works are about him dealing with heartbreak, or him dealing with being an outsider, or him dealing with success and how he relates to that. So in a similar way, at A Song of Ice and Fire, there should be a simple kind of basic idea he's pulling from that he's using over and over again with a lot of his characters, and it just so happens that we get some very good quotes that illustrate the idea of cripples, bastards, and broken things. I think maybe the most famous one is probably Robin John. Do you want to read this first one?
Sure. That morning he called it first. I'm Lord of Winterfell, he cried, as he had 100 times before. Only this time, Robb had answered, You can't be Lord of Winterfell, you're bastard born. My lady mother says you can't ever be the Lord of Winterfell. I thought I had forgotten that. Jon could taste blood in his mouth from the blow he'd taken. That quote comes to you from A Storm of Swords, Jon 12.
Yeah, and I think right there, that's the basic emotion that I think that you can really draw out of many, many characters and arcs and myths, even from A Song of Ice and Fire. The idea of someone you've grown up with, your friend, a member of your family, who has told you that you cannot have the things you want, that you don't deserve the things you want.
Exactly, and that idea of inequality just from something that you couldn't control, that you were born with.
And a lot of the myths and plots end up focusing around that, of characters who are trying to essentially change their stars, who are trying to change the circumstances of their birth or change society so that they are getting what they think they deserve. I think a really good example of that is Tyrion, when he's talking to Lord Tywin about Casterly Rock. I'm just going to read this one real fast. His father's mouth grew hard. Your brother's birthright? The knights of the King's Guard are forbidden to marry, to father children, and to hold land. You know that as well as I. The day Jaime put on that white cloak, he gave up his claim to Cashley Rock, but never once have you acknowledged it. It's past time. I want to stand up before the realm and proclaim that I am your son and lawful heir. Lord Tywin's eyes were pale green flecked with gold, as luminous as they were merciless. Cashley Rock, he declared, in a flat, cold den tone. And then, never. And that is an excellent parallel between Jon and Tyrion, and really emblematic of what we're talking about.
Exactly. It's the system and the people who are supposed to love you and support you, treating you as lesser, first, again, something that you cannot control, and how that creates this withholding of love, and that definitely comes through in Tywin and Tyrion's story, but we're going to come back to that.
We will come back to that later. I just thought those were two...
Yes.
These are two ways that George has made it plain for you to read if you were having trouble picking up on it. It's like, these two characters... Also, I think these are... Yes. And both of these quotes come from A Storm of Swords. Not that... I mean, far apart from each other within the story, but not far apart each other in terms of what it means for the arcs and the POV characters.
Did I have the chapter right?
Yep.
So impressive.
Storm of Swords, Tyrion 1.
Fucking luminary stuff. Okay.
Luminous. Luminous.
But yeah, and we can see how this sort of conflict within characters, as we see in Tyrion, causes something to change. It causes growth in different ways for different characters in them. And that's something that propels the story forward. It's these human emotions that move A Song of Ice and Fire.
And specifically create rage and anger and resentment. Like, for example, Tyrion, he ends up basically trying to burn down House Lannister because he's been denied what he thinks he deserves. Jon, in his internal POV, also thinks about doing that himself. After that quote, the one with Robb and Jon beats the crap out of Iron Emmett almost to death because he's so angry about that. And that's something, as we're talking about the others and the humans and the children, that's something we should remember. It's not just that these characters feel slighted and they're upset about what has happened to them, the circumstances of their birth. It's that they're also, because a lot of them are High Lords, or a lot of them are the nobility, they have the ability to do something about it. So let's move on to the origin of the others, since we were just talking about that, and how this relates to them.
Yeah, so in the television show, we get an explanation of how the others come about, and it's through the children of the forest feeling fear as they have to face the first men, and feeling that they are losing this battle. They are losing their home, and thus they take a human, and through a ritual of putting dragonglass, aka obsidian, into his heart, turn him into the first other/White Walker.
Yes, but this is from the children's perspective. It's also lacking context about who that man is. How did he get there? How did he even end up tied to that tree when that happened? Did he go willingly? Was this something that he wanted to do? Did he not really understand the consequences of it? And I think that's an important part that we'll eventually probably get in the show. We'll probably get more in the spin-off show, The Long Night. I imagine who that person is will be covered more there. In the books, it's much more clear that this character, who may be the Night King, who may be any of these historical figures, mythological figures, sort of amalgamated. No, that's not a word.
Amalgamated. You just flip some of the letters around.
Combined into one figure, somebody who interacted with the children in some way and became the first other, basically.
Exactly. And so for me, part of why I questioned whether it was born only out of the children of the forest desire is because, again, so much of A Song of Ice and Fire centers around the human heart in conflict with itself. And George seems to feel that the way humans would act towards something is different than the way many of his other magical creatures do.
Exactly right. In particular, even the first time we meet the others, what are they doing? They're showing up to fight Waymar Royce wearing armor. They have swords. They laugh at him. They know what duels are. So we're kind of being told very early on that these creatures are not human anymore in structure, but in their core, they still are. They still remember what it was like to be a human because they understand what to do with Waymar.
Yeah, and they feel that they are superior, maybe, to humans in some way. Even
Yeah, that
though
is a large part of it. They
that
are
is their
laughing at
core.
him.
Yeah, that's how I saw it. And the actions of lazily flicking his not magic sword away.
Yeah. I, so to go back to what you were talking about, how men would act differently, do you want to read this quote you pulled?
Yeah, so I think that something that really embodies this is when Bran is talking to the children of the forest, and Leaf is talking about how many different creatures have died since the first men came to Westeros and what happened to them. And it goes, "Gone down into the earth," she answered, "into the stones, into the trees. Before the first men came, all this land that you call Westeros was home to us. Yet even in those days we were few. The gods gave us long lives, but not great numbers, lest we overrun the world as deer will overrun a wood, where there are no wolves to hunt them. That was in the dawn of days, when our sun was rising. Now it sinks, and this is our long dwindling. The giants are almost gone as well, they who were our bane and our brothers. The great lions of the western hills have been slain. The unicorns are all but gone, the mammoths down to a few hundred. The direwolves will outlast us all, but their time will come as well. In the world that men have made, there is no room for them, or us." She seemed sad when she said it, and that made Bran sad as well. It was only later that he thought, men would not be sad, men would be wroth. Men would hate and swear a bloody vengeance. The singers sing sad songs where men would fight and kill.
I think that last line is particularly important for what we're talking about, in that they would be wroth, they would swear bloody vengeance, they would want to fight and kill the people that are threatening them, and yet you have the children creating the others who are those things. So it seems, I think it's implied heavily that although the children did make the others, they did not make them as hateful and as destructive as they are. That it appears there was a collaboration with man, where angry humans, these cripples, bastards, and broken things, were empowered by the children and then sort of got out of their control, so to speak.
Yes, and part of that hate could be at the system that has put them in position, but I think it also comes back to the choice to portray this idea of hate of mankind's um of mankind's wrath, that anger and that cold, again, hate, is something that we see in a lot of literature. It's something that our societies associate those emotions with one another, and I think that this poem by Robert Frost called Fire and Ice is very much something that is driving and inspiring George. George has even explicitly said that, part of the name of the series was heavily inspired by this poem.
Mm-hmm.
Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of hate and anger in ice. It makes sense as we see the fire hatred, the Valyrians and their dragons, and how they burn the world in order to shape it to themselves. It makes total sense that we would see the ice version of that. Somebody that is harnessing the other side of the coin, or the other side of this dichotomy.
Oh, the other side?
Yes.
Of the coin? Oh,
the other side.
That. I also like this line, and it's something that I've only really thought about when I was pulling this poem for today. I've thought of this poem before in regards to this, but this idea of, but if it had to perish twice, because this is something that the others use, right? They use this idea of bringing someone back to life, so that essentially they have to perish twice as a conduit for them and their hate through the whites.
That's a great point.
So, I don't know. I don't know if that's just something that George was like, hey, but what if I made that literal? That would be funny.
He does that quite a lot, where he takes abstract ideas and it's like, what if it were true?
Yeah, not even just abstract ideas, like, to go off on a quick tangent, you know, like, the moving of Birnam Wood, in Macbeth, it moves because the men are coming through the forest and they're also carrying some branches and trees. And Tolkien decided his interpretation of that was creating the Ents.
Yeah.
And George kind of channels this a little bit in Asha's storyline. But anyway,
yeah, I think that's true. Where the
different spins.
The slaughter of the orcs falling Helm's Deep, what you're talking about is the Ents commanding the Huorns, which are essentially angry tree spirits, to uproot and move an entire forest and slay the orcs. Not only for what they were doing to Helm's Deep, but mostly because Saruman had been cutting down their trees and destroying the forest. So it's a very similar idea to the creation of the others, where it is taking something primal and using it in a very human way, a revenge. You don't usually see revenge out of nature. Nature just kind of does its thing.
Yeah, nature is above those kinds of emotions. It just will do what it will do. Whereas, of course, these really strong feelings of hate and desire are what are at the core. They're not the only things at the core of humanity.
But it's important for this.
They are, yes. And so, because of that, Matt and I have been thinking about what could be that personal conflict that is at the root of the creation of the others.
Yeah, there's quite a few myths and legends. This is not a complete list. These are just the ones we pulled. I'm sure mythological experts of A Song of Ice and Fire have more examples, but I thought these were the major ones. So one of them is the Amethyst Empress and the Bloodstone Emperor, the Grey King and his brother, and then of course the Night's King and the Lord of Winterfell. And the last one, which is more tinfoily because it's not said explicitly who this person was, but the Warg King versus the Starks. So the first one is the Amethyst Empress. This comes back from the Great Empire of the Dawn. So this is probably one of the oldest stories in the history of Westeros itself. That it's lasted this long is probably important, but I'm just going to read it out from the World of Ice and Fire. When the daughter of the Opal Emperor succeeded him as the Amethyst Empress, her envious young brother cast her down and slew her, proclaiming himself the Bloodstone Emperor and beginning a reign of terror. He practiced dark arts, torture, and necromancy, enslaved his people, took a tiger woman for his bride, feasted on human flesh, and cast down the true gods to worship a black stone that had fallen from the sky. Many scholars count the Bloodstone Emperor as the first high priest of the sinister Church of Starry Wisdom, which persists to this day in many port cities throughout the known world.
This guy just went all out. He's like, why stop at killing my sister? Let's do all the things.
Yeah, literally all the things.
He's like, we're gonna eat human flesh. We're gonna do lines of coke off the human flesh too. Like that's what this guy was out there.
Is coke in A Song of Ice and Fire? Is there coca?
Yeah, I don't know, but this guy was dropping something. All right,
he was sniffing Bloodstone.
Yeah, this guy was really just going for the gold. He's like, let's do all of the sins.
If we look at what the relationship between them were, is he was upset that his older sister got what he thought he deserved. And all the rest of it could just be throwing on badness, that he was a bad person for doing that. Like, did he actually feast on human flesh? Did he enslave people? Like, who knows?
Was he a necromancer, which, of course, the others, but yeah.
I mean, that part, if it's supposed to be a tale of the others, then probably yes, then probably a lot of this is actually true. But for the story of the Great Empire of the Dawn and the story between the father, the older sister, and the younger brother, that kind of anger led somebody to do something horrific, kill his own family, kinslaying, and then it goes on to say, cast down the true gods to worship a black stone that had fallen from the sky. So not only did he have anger at his father and his sister, it's at society itself. He tried to overthrow everything to prop himself up as what he thinks he deserves.
Yeah, that's a great point. He was reshaping the entire world with him at the center of it. I haven't thought about that. That this idea of casting down the true gods isn't just him being super sacrilegious. It's in order to create a new power structure. It's a great point.
Thank you. And that I think that right there is at the core of a lot of these myths, where the worst people in A Song of Ice and Fire are the ones that do this in particular. The ones that not only try and overthrow the people who are already in power, but to reshape the world and society for their own gain, which with the others and the Long Night, I mean, it's very easy to see that comparison where they are really trying to change the landscape in a dramatic way to one that fits them, that works for nobody else.
Yeah, because there is a way to reshape the world, and you can reshape the world for better, or at least try to. It may be inspired by your own circumstances. Like we see Jon and Daenerys try and do that. They're like, wow, what if we didn't let all the people on the other side die? Because that would also be bad for us later on in the long run when they all come back as zombies, but also these are all people too. Or Daenerys being like, wow, maybe slavery is bad and we shouldn't do that. And it is a reshaping of the world, but it's doing so for a greater good and not just for that own personal selfish desire of power.
Although we see Daenerys throwing down slavery as a good thing, that she's reshaping that world for the better. But if you're seeing it from the perspective of the Giscari, she's the worst thing that's ever happened to them. So while we're being told the Bloodstone Emperor is the worst person ever, we don't really know the perspective that's being told from, you know?
Yeah, but the Giscari reshaped the world and the power structure so that they could subjugate some people to serve them. That was pretty shitty.
It was pretty shitty, but I'm just making the point that
Yeah.
the Bloodstone Emperor could have been a good person overthrowing a bad society, but maybe it got remembered the wrong way.
It's I would put it as a comparison between Daenerys and Cersei. Daenerys is a woman claiming all this power, which women don't often do in this, I guess, world of A Song of Ice and Fire. She's doing so in trying to make a hopefully more equitable society. It obviously is very challenging, whereas Cersei, when she's trying to claim queenship, Cersei also has her share of hardships. But rather than being like, yes, I'm going to be queen, because yes, women can also be in power, she's like, no, I'm special. Only I deserve to have power. She's not using that power to be like, yeah, maybe all of the women can also have power. She's like, no, just me.
That's true. She basically just starts acting like Robert, kind of.
Yes.
Instead of trying to change any sort of dichotomy or structure at the core of their society. It's just I'm just going to make an exception for me, which we see in Fire and Blood with Jaehaerys and his idea of exceptionalism.
Mm-hmm. We're going to come back to these characters.
We'll come back to that later. Anyway, so while we move on to the next one, got a quote here about the Grey King. Eliana, why don't you read this one?
Okay. The Grey King was king over all the Iron Islands, but he left 100 sons behind him. Damn. And upon his death, they began to quarrel over who would succeed him. Brother killed brother in an orgy of kinslaying until only 16 remained. These last survivors divided up the islands between them. All the great houses of the Ironborn claimed descent from the Grey King and his sons, save, curiously, the good brothers of Oldwyck and Greatwyck, who supposedly derived from the Great King's leal eldest brother.
Interesting. So again, we have the idea of the younger brother and the older brother fighting, and in this case, the younger brother, the Grey King, who slew Naga and worshipped this drowned god and challenged the storm god and all these things, much in the same way the Bloodstone Emperor seems to have challenged the Amethyst Empress and the gods before him. It seems to be a retelling of a similar idea.
Yeah, and then it seems like some sort of, I don't know. And it ends up with this family drama replaying itself, because I guess he decided to leave 100 sons behind him, which, like, again, damn.
Dude got around.
Yeah, and because I guess no one set up a plan for what would happen when he dies, of, like, anything, it leads to these brothers who all seek power and killing each other. Also, hold on, I just want to throw out there, he left 100 sons. It is remarkable to me that each one of the sperm that reached any egg were all Y chromosomes.
Oh, good point.
Because now, I'm just wondering, like, what if he left 100 sons and he had a shit ton of daughters as well? This man really got around. I'm just saying, we don't hear about any of the daughters. If there are, it's so unlikely that all of his sperm only carry Y chromosomes, right?
Very true. But as we see in the Iron culture, that's probably, they don't value women basically at all.
Yes.
So that's why they probably all became sons.
It's true.
I think the interaction between the Grey King and this mysterious Leal eldest brother is very interesting, especially because of the way that the Good Brothers end up becoming kings themselves at one point. They sort of reverse this at some point. After a while, the Grey King's sons lose power, and the quote-unquote true eldest brother heir person, his descendants end up reasserting themselves.
Yeah, it is interesting. I don't know anything about this. You're gonna have to talk about this.
It's okay. By the way, if any of you listening want to learn more about the Grey King, definitely go check out Crowfoot Daughter. She talks about him a lot on her YouTube channel and in her writing, and very good at breaking down what these stories are really about. She kind of has a way of removing the story from the context in a very interesting way. Like we're talking about here, where the core of the story, what is actually being told with these characters, and comparing them to the culture they come from. Anyway, so I thought that was a good example.
It is also interesting, if there are some ideas, and I personally don't know how true they are or not, but there are some interesting theories, of course, that a lot of these myths, like the ones about the Amethyst Empress and the Grey King, and this is why we're going over all of these in conjunction with the history of the others, right, are retellings of the same myth.
Yes.
And the Good Brothers, the House Good Brother, their sigil is a gold-banded black war horn on red. And of course, as we know, there are various horns in this story that are important to A Song of Ice and Fire.
Especially because the Night's Watch blew horns on their charge to end the long night. So perhaps that's a call-out to the quote-unquote good brothers, the Starks, throwing down the bad brothers, the others, in a way.
Yeah, exactly, because that is a drama that unfolds later on when the Good Brothers eventually become kings, right? There's a
Earthon Good Brother.
Yeah.
And we'll be talking a little bit more about the Good Brothers and how they fit into the story when we talk about Euron in a little bit. But to move on to another mythological understanding of these ideas, you have the Warg King and the Starks. Now, the Warg King was a ally of the Children of the Forest who lived in the Wolfswood, right next to Winterfell, and ruled from Sea Dragon Point. Interesting that he rules from Sea Dragon Point. Anyway, and he gained from the children the power to warg and the skin change, and went to war against the Starks, and ended up losing. The Starks then claimed all their daughters and wives for themselves. But with the proximity to the Starks and the way this is set up, especially when you're considering the others in mind, and the and the Bloodstone Emperor and the Grey King, somebody who seized magical power in order to try and overthrow the person that's supposed to be in charge, or the person that is in charge, you can make an assumption that perhaps the Warg King is a bastard of House Stark, and that he made a deal with the children, much in the way that we see the others being created in order to throw down the quote-unquote true heirs in the Starks.
Yeah, exactly. And an interesting person is working. His history sounds a little bit like what we are given in the TV show as to the origin of the others.
Very true. And an interesting part of the Ward King is that although they were said to be wiped out, it's almost certain that the Ward King's descendants are House Blackwood, which will come up later when we're talking about Bloodraven.
Yeah. This idea that this is another one of those myths that we see over and over again throughout the story, but that the Starks would kill his sons, beasts, and green seers, etc., and then take his daughters as prizes. We see, of course, stories like of Bale the Bard, this idea of like taking a daughter. We see it amongst the wildling culture, and in that myth of the first Storm King taking the daughter Eliana of the Storm God.
The Storm God, yep.
So.
By Duran Durandon. All the Durans.
By Duran.
If that's not what that actually means, I would be surprised. It has to be Duran.
It absolutely, it's not, I mean, it's pretty much canon. I mean, we have like Tully's named after Muppets. How can it not be what George is doing? Yeah,
George likes playing with names quite a lot. And then we'll get to our last one, the most obvious one for an other First Men Stark relationship is the story of the Night King. So I'm just going to read this out. Some say he was a Bolton, old Nan would always end. Some say a Magnar out of Skagos. Some say Umber, Flint, or Nori. Some would have you think he was a Woodfoot, from them who ruled Bear Island before the Iron Men came. He never was. He was a Stark, the brother of the man who brought him down. She always pinched Bran on the nose then. He would never forget it. By the way, don't you forget it either. Message here. Pay attention to these lines, George is saying. He was a Stark of Winterfell, and who can say? Mayhaps his name was Brandon. Mayhaps he slept in this very bed, in this very room. Again, this is from A Storm of Swords. Bran 4, as we were talking about earlier with Jon and Tyrion, we're being set up the idea of a bastard who very much wants to change his place.
And it could be that very room. I'm gonna throw this out there, old Nan. I doubt it's the same bed. Beds don't last that long, okay? After a while, all that like fluff and bedding is gonna squish down with that many people like in it. We don't have spring mattresses during this time. Probably like full of hay and down. So just throwing that out there.
Very true. But the room part might be true.
Yes, the room. Okay, feasible. Yeah, and I think this is a really great quote and gets to the heart of what you and I are saying here, that there's a lot to point to the origin of the others being something born out of that hate, that desire to improve one's own place in the world, and changing the entire structure of everything because someone felt that they didn't get what they deserved, and that they may have been a Stark of Winterfell, as you were saying, like perhaps a bastard, maybe a second son, because that's what we see happens in the North. And they're like, well, shit, we have all of these sons, and well, we don't have any keeps to give them, like, anything, and so we send them to the wall because we don't know what to do with them, which is what happens with Jon.
Exactly right. And the idea that his name was Brandon also hints to the idea that this character is named Brandon Snow, probably the Night King, because the Stark Lord that threw him down is Brandon Stark. So you probably wouldn't have two full brothers that are both named Brandon. However, if one was a bastard named by a different mother, then that would kind of make sense. In the same way we see from Rhaegar, where his first wife names a child Aegon, and his second wife probably names her child Aegon too.
And coming back to Cersei, who is such a great illustration of this idea when you have her and Jaime. If both of them are named Brandon, like you said, both are named Aegon, like, who's to say what's so different about them other than, like, one had a mother who was married, the other didn't, and for Cersei, she's with Jaime, like, what does he have that I don't? We look the same, all that's different is that he has a penis and I don't.
That's true. It's a problem of biology, normally, for these stories. Whether it's you were born second or you have the wrong gender, or as we'll talk about later, if you don't have the right traits to be the quote-unquote lord. The cripple idea.
Yeah, and whatever Westerosi society says, this is who should have power, whether that's right or wrong. Someone deciding, I don't like that. And thus, to bring it back to Tyrion again, that idea of, I will be the monster that you all think that I am.
Yeah, true. And there's a few good quotes about this where it really illustrates how cripples, bastards, and broken things are seen by society. This first one here from A Storm of Swords, Cattle and 40 soldiers rode out in his escort, commanded by Walder Rivers, the eldest of Lord Walder's bastard brood, a stern, gray-haired man with a formidable reputation as a warrior. Their arrival, coming within hours of Lord Hoster's passing, had sent Edmure into a rage. Walder Frey should be flayed and quartered, he'd shout. He sends a cripple and a bastard to treat with us. Tell me there is no insult meant by that. The prejudice there within their society is just so strong.
Oh, for sure, because as we've seen in the story, just because for some reason I ended up looking a lot at House Frey for a joke of thank God it's Frey Day, where we analyze a different Frey every Friday. Yeah, I need to bring that back.
Yes, you do.
But Walder Rivers, as we see, is significantly more competent than many of his other true-born brothers. And we see that amongst the Freys, there are many who fear Walder Rivers because he is ambitious. And he does actually have a reputation as a warrior and, again, being a person who can actually get shit done. But Edmure here is just like, well, he's a bastard, therefore why would they send him to treat with us? And perhaps Walder Frey, being who he is, does mean it as a slight.
But it shouldn't be a slight, because Walder Rivers, as you're saying, is the most competent of the Freys. If you're sending Walder Rivers, you're saying that this is being taken seriously in a practical way, maybe not in an honorific way.
Exactly. He's trying to get someone who's going... He's Walder Frey is sending someone who's going to ensure that they get the goals that their family wants. And Walder Rivers, it seems like he feels as though he has to work twice as hard to get any of the recognition that his true-born brothers just automatically have bequeathed onto them.
For sure, and there's some very good theories that after the Red Wedding 2.0, which many people see coming in The Winds of Winter, that there will also be a Frey civil war. And it appears for sure that Walder Rivers, being the most brutal and feared of the Freys, will probably end up the Lord of the Twins, even though he has no right to it. Like we were talking about with Bloodstone Emperor, Grey King, Night's King, somebody that basically killed their way to the top.
And exactly, having to kill their way to the top, and this feeling that they have to overcompensate to show that they are worthy of anything, that's definitely something that we see manifest in Tyrion's storyline. It's part of why he feels he's a tender spot in his heart for Cripples, Bastards, and Broken Things, because he has had to put so much more effort to change people's perception of him, because all they see is someone, in the words of A Song of Ice and Fire, stunted and ugly. And so he has to work so much harder in order to show that, hey, look, I'm good at all these things. I fixed our sewage system. I actually made this fucking city run. I held off the Baratheon forces during the Battle of the Blackwater. And yet, each time doesn't necessarily get any sort of commendation.
True. His victory over Stannis, the quote-unquote true heir to the Iron Throne, is a very significant idea that somebody that calls himself a cripple, somebody that calls himself a bastard and a broken thing because of not only the order of his birth, but also his physical limitations, that he beats the quote-unquote best commander in Westeros, is an important message for A Song of Ice and Fire, because he does it by being better than Stannis at what he's doing.
Yeah, and having to try so much harder is because they're trying to overcome all of these stereotypes around people who are born with, like, a lesser lot in life. For example, in coming back to A Storm of Swords and Jon's storyline, in Jon 7, That was a bitter draught to drink, but John could not blame them. He was a bastard after all. Everyone knew that bastards were wanton and treacherous by nature, having been born of lust and deceit.
Now, that's sarcastic in his own head, but it's real, like we were talking about with the first quote, it is underlining just how really excluded these people are, even though, in a lot of cases, bastards end up becoming the lords of whatever they don't have any right to.
But, of course, the case is, as we see with John, and that's why part of why we get his POV, is we're humanizing that idea of, like, wait, these stereotypes, this idea that they're all ambitious and wanton and treacherous by nature, like, whoa, hold up. Who made this fucking shit up? Like, John's not that. Not at all. And we're seeing that these are just stories that society has made up, maybe, about these people in order to justify their treatment of them.
For sure. And I think it's a reasonable question. How many of these quote-unquote treacherous bastards would have become treacherous bastards if they were treated fairly? Like, yeah. John gets very good treatment from Ned's, and it annoys Catelyn because he's not treated the way bastards are supposed to be treated, but it also makes John incredibly loyal to his house in a way that even characters who are trueborn do not feel that way.
Mm-hmm. And some of that might be because Ned was raised as a second son. He, as well as, going through an entire traumatic war experience. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of things to talk about. Why Ned turns out to be someone who wants to show the children in his life love. And this idea of, like, what society expects of them, whether that's right or wrong, is something that, again, is definitely explored in A Song of Ice and Fire, because we aren't seeing a lot of these POVs through the firstborn sons for whom everything has been laid out for them. We're exploring A Song of Ice and Fire through the perspectives of characters who feel outside of the norm of who gets power. These are the people who are very much outsiders in that Westerosi system.
Exactly. And I think we've talked at length already about Tyrion and Jon as perfect examples of this, but I think one person that I think is an interesting way of thinking about this, and a way that George eventually got to, would be Jaime. How he does start off as the opposite of one of these characters. He is in the in crowd. He is the heir to Casterly Rock. He gets everything he wants. But that's not when we meet Jaime. We meet Jaime after that has all been taken from him.
Mm-hmm. We see a little bit of it before, just so that George can show us that character growth and that change of what the world looks like. The character growth and change between someone who feels that they have everything, and then what it's like for them to be able to compare, like, oh, this is what it's like to not have that sort of power. And yeah, exactly. It's relevant that we only see Jaime during that time where he becomes a cripple.
And a broken thing.
Yes.
His chapter in particular where he's standing watch over Tywin is really Jaime working out quite a lot of his internal conflicts and issues in a way that it's very cerebral, in a way you don't usually see from other characters, because he's really just standing still, going over his whole life up to that point and all of his mistakes and where he wants to go going forwards.
Yeah, and he has to, like, reassess everything that he's thought that he was, and he's like, was that all I was, a sword hand? And has to try and figure out, oh, I need an actual personality now. And as we see for people like Tyrion, that's something that they've always felt that they needed to have. Like, I might not be good with a sword, but I have books, I have my wits, and that's how I'm going to navigate the world.
True, and Jaime's just, like, comparing himself to these other characters, being like, wow, I really didn't have to do anything. This was all really easy for me. Like, even his sword hand was a natural-born gift. I mean, he was trained from early on, but it's clear that he was an absurd natural talent with the sword. And he was born with good looks, he was born charming. So he didn't have to work for anything. And I think that's the difference between a lot of these characters.
Mm-hmm. And then we get another character, right? Like, I'm gonna go into Bran, right?
Yeah.
So, and then we get the other character who ends up becoming crippled because of Jaime, because he was like, I can do anything to anyone, I get to take anything from anyone. At the beginning of the story, because of him being born with all of that power. We have Bran,
Yeah.
who, from his own childish curiosity, he just wanted to climb and shit, ends up being thrown from a tower, and then suddenly he's losing that dream of being a knight. Everything that he thought that he would be able to have.
Yep. Becomes, unfortunately, one of the crippled. The quote from Tyrion that starts this off is in relation to Bran, where Tyrion is giving Robb a plan for a saddle so that Bran can ride again. And Robb's like, why are you trying to help him? It's like, somebody should help him. People should be trying to help people like Bran, who have had unfortunate things happen to them.
Exactly, and there is something there, right? That Bran's powers awaken in that moment of brokenness for him.
Mm.
And we explore a lot of the story of Bran's story in relation to his blossoming powers, but his powers seem to become stronger as he relates less to this body that he now has. And in order to escape his reality and all of his dreams being taken away, the fact that he feels he no longer has power, people make fun of him or think of him as Bran the Broken, he tries to create a new reality for himself by being a wolf, or in taking it from others, like Hodor. And even though Hodor obviously is in pain and doesn't like his body being taken over, Bran's like, well, because this thing has been done to me, let me do this to you a little.
I think that's an excellent point. Human skin changing, specifically what happens to Hodor, I think is maybe the worst thing that's in A Song of Ice and Fire. The way it dehumanizes Hodor, the way it takes away everything that he has. And when you compare it to what happened with Varamir and Thistle, where he tries to claim her body, and she just starts screaming, bites out her own tongue, claws her own eyes to stop him. That's happening with Hodor. And Bran, like you said, doesn't care because he's trying to reclaim what he already had.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
It's, in a way, you can see, although I don't think most people would draw a comparison between Bran and the others in terms of somebody who's aggrieved and trying to, like you were saying, reclaim their birthright, reclaim what they think they should have. He's doing awful, awful things to do it.
Exactly, and I think that maybe it's a step, it's a way to give us a taste of course we feel sympathetic towards Bran. Like, he's a little boy, and this awful thing happened to him, and we've seen him at the beginning of the series, right? Where, as Catelyn says, everyone loves Bran. He was a sweet boy who gave smiles easily, and everyone just, like, wants to give him a hug. And that doesn't excuse at all what he's doing to Hodor, but in many ways we're exploring, like, how someone ends up going down the path that whoever might have been the first White Walker or started them would have.
Exactly, and it parallels Tyrion quite a bit. And how do you get from the point where you have a sympathetic character? Actually, George has called Tyrion a villain in the past.
Yeah, as early as A Clash of Kings.
Yeah, he has, in questions to fans, he said, yeah, Tyrion's like one of my favorite characters because he's a villain. You're seeing the birth of a villain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead.
And exploring it through Tyrion, and in a way this idea of gender as it manifests in A Song of Ice and Fire, Tyrion's not able to perform what this idea of masculinity of being like a knight and good at fighting and able-bodied, but when everything's taken from him at the end of A Storm of Swords, he does something kind of like Bran, right? We see that in Westerosi society, and a lot of like the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, women aren't always seen as being the owners of their own body, and what Tyrion does is really terrible and horrendous, but he threatens to and maybe does rape a sex slave in Pentos, in Illyrio's manse, and he does it for sure in Salhoris, where you can see, like, there's this woman, she's basically, like, completely dead-eyed, but he does it anyway, and thinks that because the world has been so terrible to me, why should I not be terrible to others? Why should I just not live up to this and take from them all that's been taken from me?
It's a very, I would agree with George. It's a villainous way of looking at the world where if I can't have it, no one can, and proceeds to try and burn down the world behind him. Like, I think it's undersold just how awful it is the way he convinces Aegon to essentially charge off to Westeros to his death. He's essentially pushing that kid to an invasion that will surely fail just because he wants to.
Yeah, he's doing it, like, basically for the lulz. He's like, whatever. I don't care. I want to burn Westeros. I want to burn down the society that has burned me. And had anyone shown him, like, granted, it's not, like, their fault, but, like, it becomes this vicious cycle.
Mm.
And out of that hate that he would show, more pain is caused and more broken men from, like, this war that'll start because he was like, whatever. Yeah, Aegon, go do it. Go to Westeros.
Jon, in particular, especially in Dance with Dragons, starts feeling the same way, especially after Stannis offers him to be the king of, or the Lord of Winterfell, where he has that one dream where he's on top of the wall and he starts killing all of his friends. He chops off Robb's head and screams out at the night that he is the Lord of Winterfell, that he's finally taking what he thinks he deserves. I think a lot of these POVs have kind of a slow burn in that way, where it's like, how do you get to the point where you betray everything you are, your family, the society you're in? Well, by being treated the way Jon and Tyrion and Bran, and, well, I think a perfect example of this is Theon.
Yes, exactly. And the difference between Jon and characters like Tyrion and Theon is Jon had a lot of love, at least from his siblings and his father, if not Catelyn, growing up. Whereas Theon always felt like that outsider. While maybe he was able to grow up alongside the Stark kids, he always knew, same as Jon, that he wasn't a Stark and had, in many ways, a sword looming over his neck, knowing that if anything happens from the Greyjoys, that's it for him. And because of that, Ned distanced himself from Theon, because I think he had to emotionally in case Ned would ever have to kill Theon.
I think that's absolutely true. And Theon, none of this is his fault. He was given over as a kid. He had no part in Balon's rebellion. The fact that he could be killed at any time is not for anything he did. He is just a kid. And it's unfortunate that that happened to him. But then you see what he does with that anger, where he betrays Robb to Balon, and then he burns Winterfell. His intention, even though he doesn't actually do it, is to find and kill Bran and Rickon.
It's multiple things, right? It's anger. It's also a desire for love, because Theon was at a weird age, right? He's young, he's a child, but he's not super old yet to necessarily understand it. What would be happening is, like, you're like, why is my dad giving me away to live with this other family? And then finally he gets a chance to prove himself to his dad, and he's showing up. He's trying to look like the way he's been raised to think a lord should look based on his upbringing at Winterfell, right? And his dad's like, well, that's not how we do things around here. I didn't raise you to be like that. Well, shit, he didn't raise you at all, because he wasn't he wasn't there. And he's like, well, this is my dad. Who's my family? And he's doing all these terrible things out of, like, just trying to once again get in his dad's good graces, become heir to the Iron Islands again, possibly, and just, daddy notice me.
But he ends up just choosing not Balon, because we see during his arc as Reek that the way he reclaims his identity and his pride in himself is by embracing his Starkness. Which is probably the turning point back from him being a villain into probably probably a heroic character for the rest of the books.
Yeah, for him, we're supposed to see what happens to Theon, I think, is something horrible. Like, we were like, oh, Theon did some, like, pretty heinous, cruel shit, but does that warrant what Ramsay does to him? I think we're supposed to question that, and the beginning of maybe seeing Theon do heroic things, it comes when he rescues Jane Poole.
Yes.
Who, Jane Poole is someone who has been subjected to awful things at the hands of Littlefinger by being forced into basically sex slavery and human trafficking. When she's brought back to Winterfell, I was like, yeah, this is Arya Stark, obviously. And Jane, like Theon, wanted to be a Stark, right? But it's given to her in the worst way possible. And as a woman, she's already, like, seen as having less rights. Then we have Ramsay, who's being awful to her. And later on, like, she can't even come out and be like, I'm not Arya, because she doesn't have that power, because she doesn't fit, again, into that structure of who has power as nobility, even, like, in Westerosi society. She's just the steward's daughter.
Yeah, she has no ability to change anything, and nothing that's happening to her is her fault in any way. It's just an awful, awful thing. It's probably why Theon feels so much empathy for her and sympathy as he journeys back from Reek to Theon. He's seeing himself in her. Somebody who is being tortured for something that's really not their fault.
Yes.
And that's sort of one of the overarching messages we're talking about is characters who were born with bad stars, basically.
Yeah.
And what do you do about that?
Yeah. And another one of them being Aeron Greyjoy.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot to unpack here.
There's quite a lot, but it works well with the another character who fits this really well that we'll probably talk about after in Euron. But Aeron is somebody that from a young age was victimized by his own brother and really didn't have a place on the Iron Islands.
He didn't have a place. He was a second son, and apparently he was a second son of another second son. Well, not second son of a second son. He was not... Sorry. Let's start all this over.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Aeron was much further down the line of inheritance. He didn't get to be the first son who was going to inherit anything. He was like, well, I had to figure out what I'm going to do. And then, of course, as you said, we find out that this whole time, like, Aeron, part of his fervor for the drowned god is he's found some sort of salvation and religion after this horrible thing happened to him as he was a child. He was molested and raped by his older brother, Euron, who's trying to just exact power over Aeron, and Aeron's just like, this sucks.
He's emotionally crippled by that. He's an outsider in their society. He's even an outsider within the Greyjoy family because you have the Lord Reaper Balon, you have Victarion, his strong right hand, you have Euron the Crow's Eye, and then what's left for Aeron to do? Yeah,
so he tries to find his own path eventually after he almost dies through Jesus, and by Jesus I mean the drowned god. And in that way finds structure. He finds his own place within this system by being part of their church. But in doing so, he's also reinforcing other things within the system. Like, this is how Ironborn culture is supposed to be, like with the thralls and the salt wives. And he's like, well, Asha can't be the heir to the Iron Islands. He's like, she's a woman. That's not how we do things. And ends up being a part of the system as a broken thing himself.
Yeah, he becomes radicalized, and if he became the leader of the Iron Islands based on what he preaches after his resurrection into the drowned god worship, he would probably be seen as one of the worst Ironborn kings of all time. Just from the way he wants to reinforce every awful thing they do.
Yeah.
So let's move on to a different class of characters, the women in A Song of Ice and Fire, and how they relate to Cripples, Bastards, and Broken Things, because they have systemic problems against them, but also personal ones. So why don't you lead off, Eliana?
Yeah, sure. As a woman.
Yes, as a woman.
As a woman. So yeah, we can't necessarily argue that these women are bastards, cripples, or broken things, but George does seem to be, again, setting up A Song of Ice and Fire by looking at people who have to find a different way to make the world, like, fucking tolerable for themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that is... And we see that gender can break down a lot of these women in different ways. Like, we've talked a lot about Cersei. Cersei is not a good person. She kills her best friend, assuming you can call any relationships that Cersei has friendships. Because she was like, no, you can't have a crush on my brother. My brother's only for me. And this is even before they're having sex. It's like, what? Chill out, girl. But despite all that, Cersei also... George is trying to frame her sympathetically as... She was also the victim of abuse. Like, even though Cersei isn't a good person, the things that happen to her aren't in reaction to her crimes. They're just in reaction to her being a woman. Like when Robert hits her, or she has to endure marital rape at his hands. And then we also, of course, have a lot of other characters who have to navigate this world where those are threats for them. For example, Sansa, the threat of sexual assault is always looming over her after she loses the protection of being the daughter of the High Lord, or being daughter of the Hand of the King while he's there. And she's just become a pawn, and she's trying to figure out, what can I do? How can I try and wrest power from my position instead of just being someone else's claim to Winterfell? We have Arya, who feels outside of the norm because she's been told, well, women are supposed to like these things. You're supposed to like dresses and the songs and stuff, and they're going to marry a lord and give him babies. And Arya's like, that's not me. I want to play with swords and not play. I want to learn how to fight. I want to have swords. I hang out with the stable boys, and that's not the world that I want to live in. And trying to figure out the world that way, in many ways similar to Brienne, who maybe she would have wanted those things, but because she was deemed as too ugly and masculine, she also had an interest in swords, doesn't fit into that same structure. And then, of course, we have Asha, who was allowed to explore those interests in the way that Arya was, like of, hey, I'm going to do these things that men do, and Balon loved her for that, because she was the last child that he had left to him. Yet the rest of her society laughs at her for trying to lead them, when she's shown that she's every bit as capable of a captain and fighter as the rest of them. And then, of course, we have, even in Dorne, where women are allowed to inherit, we have Arianne fearing that her father doesn't love her and has never loved her and is giving away her birthright. And then finally, of course, we have Daenerys, who is the orphan princess who's grown up under the shadow of her abusive brother and is sold into slavery. And while there's an arguably, like, kind of okay wedding night, which it's shaky, has to endure after that marital rape in the subsequent days until she learns to find power for herself. And Daenerys is an interesting exploration of, what happens when you give power to someone who's supposed to be seen as powerless. Sorry, I went on a long thing there.
It's okay.
You weren't saying anything. I was like, I guess he wants me to talk about all the women, so I'm going to just go through all of them.
No, you did great. I think you're exactly right that I think with almost every one of these characters, they have been threatened with sexual violence at one point in their arc.
That's true. That's true.
In a way that the men they are threatened with violence usually, but not specifically sexual violence. And in their society, like you were talking about with Asha, where she is not a quote-unquote cripple, bastard, or broken things, but she is a bastard in the way that she is the last option, the lowest on the totem pole in terms of the Ironborn, in much of the same way we were talking about with characters like Tyrion or Jon, who are probably capable to be the lords of whatever it is that they feel they deserve, they should have, but are being ignored for systemic reasons and parts about themselves that they have no control over.
Yeah, she's being ignored over, like, her uncle Victarion.
The dumbass.
An idiot. Like, he can't make that guy the Lord. Like,
Euron?
Yeah, Euron's a psycho. You can't think neither of them are good choices to lead the Iron Islands. Like, we get Victarion's POV, and he's not a bastard, cripple, or broken thing, but he isn't the first son. And
he obsesses over that.
Exactly, and he obsesses also over the way that Euron has abused him in different ways, like psychologically, and nope, there's no justifying Victarion beating his wife to death.
Nope, he's just a shithead.
Yeah.
I think that's it's a way that George has taken this initial concept and flipped it in a way that makes sense for a lot of these characters, that they do have underlying things that are holding them back from being who they want to be. And many of them are characters that are seizing their own agency back from society. And for characters like Daenerys in particular, she's seen as, at least from the Giscari perspective in Slaver's Bay, and Volantis and Karth, they see her as like almost like a Night's King character or a Night's Queen character, where she is doing awful things. She's like the worst thing that's ever come to Essos. Whereas when you see from her POV and the people that know her, that she's very much different. And it seems the only thing she's really doing is upsetting their society while being a woman, and they take that personally.
Yeah, and, you know, she's messing with their money, which was dirty money anyway.
Yeah, which is interesting in the way that it is a simple concept at the core of Song of Ice and Fire, these outsiders trying to become insiders, but it's not always simple who is right and who is wrong in that relationship. Sometimes we get characters who are very wrong for what they do. In particular, characters like, I would say, Ramsay and Euron, who feel the same way these characters do, but what they do with that anger is just out of control. Let's go back to kind of another sort of class of cripples, bastards, and broken things, and I would say that is, I guess, the losers of A Song of Ice and Fire, characters who fit more an outsider class than any of the three particular things. So you get characters like Quentin, you get characters like Sam, or Barristan Selmy in some ways, Ned, Arya, Hota.
Yeah, and Quentin and Sam, it's interesting because they were born in a position that should have bequeathed them all of that power, but because Westerosi people were like, no, you gotta be masculine, right? You have to be a fighter. And Quentin's like, I have to do this thing, and then my dad will think I'm great, and this is what I'm supposed to do. And everyone's like, Quentin, you don't have to do this. But he does it, and then Sam's father is like, I'm going to just abuse you until you turn into a manly man, and it's like, this was not, I think, the wisest course.
No, very much not so. And they are, like, Sam is unusual, I think, in this construct, because he, like you said, he's somebody who should have everything, but he came away from it broken himself, from the treatment of trying to be somebody that he's not.
Yeah, and I think part of it is because part of why his father treated him that way is because his father had all these prejudices of like, oh, liking songs, that's what women like. And that made him outside of the system that he should have been acting or performing.
Very true. Quentin as well. Although in Dorne he would not inherit because of their laws. Yeah. He, like you said, he is being told by many people to try it anyway, but within their society, I mean, he's called the Frog because he's not very attractive. He's not a leal person. He's not aggressive. He's not strong. He's pretty short. There's no reason Quentin should be trying to do this. He should let Ariane just be the Princess of Dorne. But because of the society, they're telling him he should try anyway, even though it's not right for him.
Yeah, he was like made fun of growing up. He's called Frog because he would like hop to it every time.
That's
in order in the Windblown, but he's like, shit, this is what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to be this kind of person, and he's just trying, and you can see that he doesn't feel comfortable in anything that he's doing. He's like, damn, I gotta somehow convince this supposedly really pretty lady that she wants to marry me, but I'm just me. And he like Sam but betrays a lot of that insecurity about who they are and what they bring to the table, and they feel undeserving of what their cup is and trying to be worthy of it.
Yeah, definitely. It's an inverse example where it's not just the people who are born on the outside that are destroyed by the way their society functions and the way it heaps expectations and particular roles on people. Even the people that are in the positions of power are sometimes destroyed by it too.
Yeah, like Ned.
Yeah.
He also was like, wow, I have to be worthy now of this thing. I guess I'm Lord of Winterfell now. My family's dead. I watched my sister die in front of me, and now I'm gonna take care of her son, I guess. And he's definitely a broken thing. Like, Ned is an exploration in PTSD and what that does to someone. He says, like, towards the beginning of his storyline, in the Game of Thrones, he's like, none of this was meant for me. All of this, including you were all meant for Brandon. And he's just trying to fill those shoes. And he's like, I didn't want to be Hand of the King, but like, oh my god, everything is falling apart.
Yeah.
What has Robert done? Like, someone who was raised to have all that power. Robert, he was raised to be like a first son. He wasn't necessarily raised to be king, but he has it anyway. He has everything, and like, he's totally unqualified.
Yeah, and although Ned does very well during Robert's rebellion in terms of winning battles and doing what he's supposed to, it's clear from his POV that he never wanted any of it. Like you said, he was like, this was all meant for Brandon. I mean, honestly, he probably thought until the day that Brandon and Rickard died that he's like, maybe I'll marry a Shara Dane, and that'll just be like a good time for me. Or he'll find some quiet way to live out his life as like a lord's son without much expectations on him. And then all of a sudden he gets all the expectations and it destroys him.
Yeah, we see all of these ghosts that follow him. And I think that another character that's interesting is like having Barristan Selmy. He's not necessarily a loser. He's like a hero in Westeros.
But he doesn't feel like it.
He doesn't feel like it. He feels like he's failed several times because look at all these kings that have died while he was supposed to be protecting them. And also we're not exploring Barristan Selmy, the hero in his prime, when he's capable of doing anything. We're exploring Barristan Selmy later in life. And as we see being older in Westeros, especially with the way that they framed Barristan Selmy's dismissal, can be seen as a weakness.
It's true. And he has, much like Ned, a lot of regrets or many characters too, of the road not taken, where at times he thinks like, what if I just let Aerys die in Duskendale? What if I didn't do that? He also thinks about like, what if I'd actually unhorsed Rhaegar and told Ashara what I really feel about her? What if he hadn't become a Kingsguard? And although I think for most people, Bran wants to be a Barristan the Bold character, but then you see what it's actually like on the inside, and there's a lot of anger at his role, even though it's one he chose. And much like a lot of these characters, I think some people have drawn out comparisons between him and Criston Cole coming up in the Winds of Winter, and he may do a horrible thing, something awful, something society will look down on him for, that Barristan the Bold will become Barristan, like the Hated, or something like that. And it's a lot of resentment and anger, much in the same way that, linking it back to the original point, talking about the others, where how people, even though they can seem to have everything, even though John gets chastised for feeling like he's so picked on, and then he gets righted, and they're like, John, you had like everything at Winterfell. You are basically a lord at this point. You have nothing to be upset about. But even characters who have everything can still find this anger and resentment at society that you wouldn't expect.
Yeah, and I think for Barristan, a lot of it is regret. But yeah, I think we might see some of that resentment and stuff, and we might see if, as Brynden Beefish says, Barristan taking on a Kristen Cole role.
Yeah.
What Barristan will do in that moment then is he's upholding all of those older ideas again, of those traditional ideas that Westeros has. He's going to be picking the man who looks like a warrior. Someone who theoretically has all those trappings. Finally, we're gonna kind of like touch on Arya Hota, but Arya Hota is very much, like Barristan, he also hasn't been able to hold power. He was forced by his family because he was one of many children, and they were like, well, we don't fucking know what to do with you, so we're going to give you to this Norvoshi order, and you're going to be castrated and become a warrior. And he's like, I asked for none of this, but he's just accepted that that's his lot in life. But he
doesn't always think that way. In his internal POV, he does think about how he's in Dorne, the place where sexuality is on display all the time, and he has to be there just the watcher, instead of participating in the society in the way that everyone else does.
Yeah, there's that. And through Arya, we get a lot of, let's do these characters first before we go into the villains. Because through Arya, we get an exploration of characters who also don't fit into that system, right? We get an exploration of Doran Martell, who doesn't fit what people think a lord should be like. He's chastised for seeming weak by his nieces because it seems like he's not doing anything. But Doran is a thinker. He also isn't. He's not a warrior like his brother Oberyn, but he is the grass that hides the snake, and because of that, he's just trying to do what he thinks is best for his people, despite seeming like he's weak and now no longer able to really stand.
Well, even like in reality, like he gets made fun of for his illness, and that he is a crippled character who has to be wheeled around in a wheelchair, and his enemies do use that against him in a physical display of weakness, that he can't even move himself. How can he be our kind of lord? And when you compare that to Oberyn, the Viper who traveled everywhere, who was a great fighter in his own, Doran does not fit. And maybe he would be a different person if he was treated a little better when he was growing up for the way he is.
Yeah. And we see that like show up in other characters, like characters we haven't quite met yet, like Willis Tyrell, who seems like he is a perfectly good heir to Highgarden and is a very lovely boy. Except
for one thing, unfortunately.
Exactly. Oberyn.
Yep.
Doran's younger brother. Unhorsed Willis in such a way that the horse fell on him, and now he's a cripple.
Yep, and now he's unmarried, even though he's the heir to Highgarden. That doesn't happen too often. And in a way, you can see kind of the relationship between Willis and Garland being similar to Oberyn and Doran, where people are pushing for the younger brother because he fits their idea of a lord better than the person actually filling the role.
Yeah, and it's like you said, and also, as we saw with like when Tyrion was offered as a prospective marriage match to people, like people see it as an insult, right? If you are offered someone who isn't able-bodied, whether that's right or not, because Willis Tyrell Seems like a perfectly eligible bachelor, if you ask me.
He seems like it, and the only person he's matched with is Sansa Stark, who at that point is the daughter of a traitor.
Yeah.
Seen as damaged goods, basically.
Yeah. I mean, she was pretty jazzed about the match. Everyone was jazzed about it except for, I guess, the Lannisters and Littlefinger, because that, like, messed up their plans. But she's like, this is great. I mean,
yeah.
I don't really know him, and, you know, it's fine. She's like, you know, maybe he's, like, crippled, but, you know, it's okay. And her concern is more of getting him to love her. She's like, he's gonna love me for who I am eventually.
Yeah.
It's not the other way around. She's not like, can I love Willis? She's like, will Willis love me?
It's just surprising a schemer like Olenna Tyrell has not been able to find a match for Willis, or maybe she hasn't found one that she thinks is worthy of the heir of Highgarden, because people keep thinking, well, he's crippled. So perhaps this is going to be a weird way of saying it, but maybe like the power levels of the matches aren't working out, much in the same way with Tyrion, where Olenna thinks Willis should be treated like the heir of Highgarden, and people are like, nah, he's a crippled bookie weirdo, so we're not going to send our best daughters your way, basically.
Yeah, and this comes up multiple ways throughout A Song of Ice and Fire, like in other characters, like for example, Sweet Robin, who's probably marked for death now,
Yes.
and the Unsullied, that they, especially people like Grey Worm or Stalwart Shield, you know, they didn't ask for this, and they are seen as less than because they were forced to be castrated, which is the same as what happened with Varys. But they all try and find power in their own ways. And of course, along with all of these characters that we've explored, again, this can lead to someone becoming what we think of as a villain, like Littlefinger.
He is probably maybe one of the more direct examples of this, where his anger at society and his wants and desires are personified. It's Catelyn. He doesn't get Catelyn because he is lowborn, because he is not a person like Brandon Stark, where you can see Brandon Stark and Littlefinger as maybe one of the most perfect examples of this in the story. Completely opposite characters, and Brandon gets what he wants and Littlefinger doesn't, mostly because of just birth and genetics and the way that they were put into this world. But it's an understandable anger, but what Littlefinger does with it is extremely dramatic.
Yeah, and as you're saying about, you know, Brandon gets everything, and he adds injury to that insult.
Yeah.
Beats Littlefinger almost to death. And then Littlefinger's like, you know what? I'm gonna just, fuck it, I'm gonna tear down the system, maybe. I don't know if that's what he thinks or not, he's just shitty and weird and creepy. But this is how he became shitty and weird and creepy, alright? This is the story all about how his life got turned upside down.
The Fresh Prince of Riverrun?
So, yeah, that is kind of what it is, only, you know, significantly less cool.
I would like to see Will Smith playing Littlefinger. That'd be kind of funny.
Actually, he would probably kill that role.
Probably pretty good at it.
He's great. Anyways.
I think another character who I think is shown as a dark mirror of another character is Ramsay Snow. He's shown as the Dark Maker of Jon Snow, where it's this character, Ramsay, for the many, many awful ways he acts and the way he behaves. A lot of it comes from the awful treatment of Roose Bolton and his mother and reek of him when he was growing up. But in Westerosi society, the way Ramsay was treated is how they're supposed to.
Yeah,
which is very fucked up.
Yeah, Ramsay grew up with no good parental figures. Because, yeah, the power structure. Roose Bolton was like, you know what? I'm gonna sleep with this. Oh, no. Roose Bolton was like, you know what? I'm going to take your wife, and she's gonna sleep with me whether she likes it or not. She did not. And then I'm going to kill you. Alright, so now there's no one who can be a father to Ramsay, right? And then Roose is like, done with that. And, like, just leaves this poor woman. And, like, how can you ask her to love a child she didn't want to have from a man who raped her?
It's, yeah. It's tough, and especially because the Lord's first night rites are a thing. Roose.
There, in the Dreadfort, not everywhere else.
Well, not anymore, but until the Targaryens showed up, that was the law. There were probably lots of kids in the North that were like that, and that Ramsay may be an example of why bastards get such a bad rep in First Men culture, because they allowed this kind of horrific thing to happen to children.
Exactly. And yeah, that's what happens when, I guess, kids don't have any love when they grow up, but also maybe something was fundamentally broken inside of Ramsay from the beginning. We don't know. Alright, this isn't something that George has given us an insight into, and I don't want it, but yeah, Ramsay, like you said, a dark mirror to Jon Snow.
And in particular, the others and their relationship to their own family, because it's almost certain Ramsay's going to kill Roose and Fat Walda and her child, as he does in the show. Where it's like, how do you get to the point where you want to burn down your own family? How do you want to turn on everybody and become a kinslayer and destroy the world? Well, if you're like Ramsay and the world has given you an extremely bad hand and there's nothing you can do about it unless you do these horrible things.
Save Fat Walda.
Save Fat Walda. She doesn't deserve this.
Save Fat Walda's baby.
And probably
my concern.
Yeah. And then probably the biggest villain probably going forward, Euron Greyjoy. And what a piece of shit he is.
Oh my God.
But it comes from what he says being it's hard to say what made him want to do what he did to his brothers. But from the way he behaves and the way he acts and the way he kind of tries to steal the Iron Island's throne and ends up doing it, and the way he treats people around him, it's like the worst possible example of what happens when somebody is denied what they want and what they think they deserve and what they will do to get it.
Yeah, it's what they think they deserve, but it wasn't like, it was somewhat unfair, but what Euron did to other people in the same way as what Ramsay does to other people, it's inexcusable. It's becomes entitlement, right? They swing so far to the other side that they're like, I will hurt anyone. And it's not justifiable.
It's not. Well, like what Tyrion does to the sex workers is not justifiable, but you have at least empathy for how he got there mentally. It's not like the quote unquote other. It's not ununderstandable.
Yeah.
It is horrible though.
And I don't know that we're necessarily asked to have empathy for Ramsay or Euron, but I do think we're asked to understand. Does that make sense?
Yeah, not sympathy, just empathy, to understand their thought processes without like being like, oh, you know the difference between those two things. Yeah. Whether or not you forgive them for kind of what they are and what they've done versus just at least getting the thought process.
Yeah. And of course, Euron's story is very much similar to, again, this sibling epic that we've been seeing throughout the entirety of A Song of Ice and Fire. We see shades of going back to the house Goodbrother and their story there. I'm going to let you explain this.
So the Euron, it's almost certain he took this name, Urthon Nightwalker, when he was in Karth. That's probably a moniker he has worn, and it's in reference to an old king of the Iron Islands, Urthon IV Goodbrother, also known as the Bad Brother. What he did was their father died while the heirs were away reaving, and Urthon instead called a king's moot while they were away, killed all the other people either before or after, and then ruled as a tyrant for much of his time. And Euron really is replaying that story in his own timeline, and it's sort of emblematic, if you want to, of the characters like the others, characters like the Night King, characters like the Bloodstone Emperor, where someone is changing the rules in order to make it so that they are on top and the horrible things they will do to do it. I mean, to get there.
Exactly. And I don't know. I lost my train of thought. Yeah, the horrible things that they would do to do it. And again, this seems to be like a recurring theme that's reinforced in the story.
Yeah, these are aggrieved younger brothers, just because they are aggrieved quote unquote bastards or outsiders, cripples and broken things, people who are not getting what they think they deserve, and how that can really fuel these kind of awful people.
Mm-hmm. And, Joffrey, and I think this is a difference, right? This is like Euron and Ramsay go through things that like a lot of other characters in the story do, and they turn out to be perfectly fine, normal people. And I think part of it is speaking to like that individualism. Like, people are different people. You can't just lump them into like, oh, because you're a bastard, because you're a second son, you're like a shitty person. Because we have someone like Joffrey who was raised to believe that everything belonged to him, and turns out he's a bastard who is taking the throne, but so are his younger brother and younger sister, who are lovely, wonderful people. Bless them. Protect Tommen and protect Myrcella. Yeah. We're gonna fail because the prophecies say so, but protect these poor, precious, lovely angels. Alright? But their older brother, Joffrey, is a monster. But he, in a way, is also a broken thing because, I mean, his father beat him almost to death. And then he's growing up in a home of domestic violence where his father, like, beats his mom every now and then. So, it's not right. But we see that, like, even when you are promised everything as the crown prince, you can still be an awful person.
Yeah. It's important, especially because of how Jon and Joffrey were initially set up in a Game of Thrones to be eventual inverses of each other, where these are all people. These are all individuals. They have wants and desires, and they have capabilities, and it's unfair to paint them this way. And the fact that they are painted in these terrible ways often makes them the monsters that society thinks they should be, in a way that is unfair but also understandable when you talk about characters like the mythological people we were talking about and the creation of the others, how you could get to this place. Well, if society treats you like a monster, maybe, like Tyrion says, you become the monster they want you to be.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think we see that a lot in these struggles for power in Westeros, right? I'm going to go into the dance first, and then we'll come back to all the other ones. Like,
sounds good.
For example, like in the Dance of the Dragons, Rhaenyra is passed over for something that she was told would be hers, because they were like, well, your younger brother is a man. And we've decided we like him more because of that. And as a result, this entire conflict, Rhaenyra loses all of her children, or not all of her children. Rhaenyra loses many of her children. She loses her lover, and it breaks her. And she becomes something of a broken thing, and she becomes the monster that they made her out to be after a while. Even though, she might have been like, okay. I don't know. We don't know what she would have been like as a queen. But both her and her brother ended up on that losing end. She becomes a shitty person, and her brother also is kind of a shitty person, and he himself becomes a cripple as well. He's injured throughout this war.
It's true. And one thing to remember, they feature prominently in Fire and Blood with the Dance of the Dragons. We have to remember that a lot of that was written from the perspective of the Maesters, who are trying to uphold a certain idea of Westerosi society and inheritance and who they're trying to favor, much the way that like Jaehaerys gets like the best press ever in that book. In a similar way, they have to paint Rhaenyra as a terrible, terrible person, because not only did she lose, but with her trying to take the Iron Throne, she represented a fundamental upheaval of their society.
That's true. If they had painted her as good, people might have been like, wow, what if we did let women inherit?
Yeah.
What if we didn't, like, let that happen?
Because in every way, Aegon is wrong for what he was doing. Because while primogeniture is a thing in Westeros before the Targaryens, the word of the king is how it goes. And Rhaenyra was the heir. But even, you see, in the modern times, Stannis uses Rhaenyra as an example of a usurper, a bastard sort of character, somebody that's upsetting society, but she really wasn't in her own time.
She wasn't. Viserys was like, this is my daughter, and I've decided that she's going to be heir. But of course, history is ripe with succession.
Yes.
Problems.
I think one of the ones we've touched on, we haven't really explained or talked about at length, is the idea of looking or appearing to be the correct lord, of having the right characteristics to rule, and sometimes that being more important than being like the actual
qualified
heir. Yeah, I think the most basic example of this is Maegor and Aenys, where Aenys is the recognized heir. He is the king of Westeros, but Maegor has Blackfyre, and he's huge, and he's strong, and he's good in a fight, and he has Balerion. He's like, these things make me king.
Yeah. And it turns out neither of those people were any good at being king.
Nope.
Turns out both of those people sucked.
They suck pretty bad.
Yeah.
But it that's an idea that continues to echo throughout Westerosi culture. I think the other big one is Daemon Blackfyre versus Daeron the Good.
Yeah, this is obviously a huge part of Westerosi history, the Targaryen history, and George explores the ripples of this conflict in the Dunk and Egg stories.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that the Blackfyre Rebellion is starting to come more to the forefront of the main series. It's touched on a lot more as it becomes fleshed out. And yeah, so what is the basic gist of the Blackfyre Rebellion?
The basic gist of the Blackfyre Rebellion is that Aegon the Unworthy was a jackass who enabled all the worst things, but the basic idea behind Daemon Blackfyre, or as he was known, Daemon Waters, but he is a Targaryen in all effect. It doesn't. The Blackfyres is really an internal civil war, and Daemon is held up as the true Targaryen heir because he is like Maegor in terms that he is huge. He's not huge, but he's strong. He's muscular. He's good with a sword. He's the kind of person that would lead a conquest. And then you have Daeron the Good, who is described as kind of pudgy and somebody that likes to make friends and somebody that likes to make alliances through politics and good sense and learning, rather than Daemon, who would fight his way to being right.
Yes, exactly. And so the conflict, of course, arises because Daeron Targaryen is presumably the true-born heir of Aegon the Fourth and was it Nerys?
Yes.
Of Aegon the Fourth and Nerys Targaryen. Both of them are Targaryens. Though there are, of course, accusations that Daeron is also a bastard between Nerys and Aemon, but whatever, I don't know. While Daemon Blackfyre is a Targaryen, also both on his mother's and father's side. He's Aegon the Fourth's son, of course, and Daena the Defiant's child. And yeah, he has all of these trappings of power, and he decides, well, I'm stronger. I have the sword. I should get to be the heir to the Iron Throne.
With an important whisper in his ear. From Bittersteel.
Yeah, who is also another Targaryen bastard. Yep. Aegon the Fourth, hundreds of sons, an orgy of brothers fighting brothers.
The Grey King, he comes back.
He's here.
He's here. But yeah, it really it's an inversion on what we would think of as the Cripples, Bastard, and Broken things, where in Daemon's eyes, Daron does not deserve the throne because he does not have, because he thinks of him as an outsider. He thinks of him as not being a true king, that he doesn't have the things a king should have. So he, the younger brother, although actually is Daemon older?
I don't remember. Let me see. We might not even have those numbers.
Okay. But Daemon, as somebody outside the succession, at least until Aegon decides to inherit everybody, feels that he has a better claim to it and starts a civil war, tries to upheave the entire society and cause the deaths of tens of thousands in a rebellion that goes on for generations, is still going on, all because he thought he deserved his father's crown.
Exactly. And anyway,
okay.
Yeah, so we have that conflict playing out again of the bastard brother being like, why shouldn't that be mine? Just because I have a different mother, a mother who is just as royal as your mother, why should I be placed second? And a key figure throughout this drama is Brynden Rivers, also a bastard of Aegon IV. Again, hundreds, so many children, so many babies everywhere, alright? For a lot of these babies, I guess. And we only really know the great bastards, right? The ones from noble houses.
Yeah, these are the great ones.
Yeah.
Who are the lesser bastards?
Yeah, what about all the good bastards? They were perfectly fine good bastards too, but they apparently were not royal enough to be, like, given, like, that much time on any of the pages. We're just looking at the ones who Aegon IV got from nobility, and Brynden Rivers is one of them, from House Blackwood, and he comes to later on be known as Bloodraven, because he's got a very cool birthmark, and
vaguely raven-shaped.
Yeah, vaguely raven-shaped. I do wonder, like, how do you know it's a raven? How do you know that's not a crow or a pigeon? Just throwing out these questions, okay? Could be any bird.
Wow.
You know I'm right. It could be any bird.
Brynden, the blood pigeon Rivers.
And, you know, he is born with something that maybe the Westerosi would see as being cripple or disfigurement. He's definitely albino, alright? He's even more so than the Targaryens usually are, like, in terms of paleness and pale hair.
His red eyes.
Exactly. He fits all of the traits of what we think of as an albino, and he ends up siding with the true-born son, Daeron the Good, against the bastard house of the Blackfyres. And this is obviously, like, a huge point in Bloodraven's story. That's, like, basically his reason for being when he's in King's Landing, until such time as Egg takes the throne and is like, I guess thanks for all you've done, but, like, some of these were definitely war crimes, and I'm sorry, you just can't stay here anymore, right? We're gonna send you up with my uncle, who is not the first son, but he's a perfectly fine man too, Aemon, and you're all gonna go to the Wall, and that's where we send bastards and second sons.
In particular, Bloodraven and House Blackwood's connection with the Children of the Forest, and how he sides with the quote-unquote trueborns, which, if you look at it from a meta perspective, is the children allying with the humans in order to stop the others. So the bastards, the broken things, the cripples, the others, and you can see them as Daemon. I mean, even when we see them in the prologue, I mean, they are described as, like, beautiful and elf-like, and, like, creatures made of, like, crystals. If they weren't evil, like, it'd be very easy to see them as the more impressive if you compare them to the modern Starks.
Exactly. And it becomes, like, this is something that I think would be really important because, like you said, Bloodraven allies with the children of the forest against the others, and that means it's just a continuation again of who he is as a person. His story is him once again standing against these bastards searching for power. And I mean, if we think about like what we've seen in the story, the TV show, and what's implied about Craster's children, like these are the children who, like with bastards and cripples and broken things, these are the children that were unwanted.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're just finding power in their own way. They're like, why should I be unwanted when look at all the things that I can do?
Yeah, from the other's perspective, if you're functionally immortal, you're made of ice, you can raise the dead into like an unbeatable army. Why aren't you the rulers of the world? They, in the same way that Daemon felt that he was better than Daeron, they feel like they're better. They feel like they should rule from their powers and their characteristics, and it's easy to see why. They, in like a fantasy magical way, yeah, they are. They're amazing.
I mean, yeah, I can't do magic shit with ice. It's
nope.
Pretty...
Can you wield a crystal sword? I can't.
No, that's very expensive. Why would I want that? That's very expensive, and it seems like a bad thing to use as a sword in general, like crystals. Anyways, I can make like an ice cube, but I even struggle getting it out of the tray. Like, how am I going to do anything? All right?
Right. The others just make ice cubes in their hands.
Exactly. And they're probably like perfect cubes too. And again, so another reason why we think that this might be the trajectory of the history of the others is because it would create that continuity for Bloodraven's storyline.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes this large cyclical epic.
So, and this isn't something George has invented. This is a long-term historical thing in the real world, particularly because George was raised Catholic, examples that come from the Bible. The initial one being, of course, Cain and Abel, the two brothers, one who killed the other.
Yes, and hold on, I'm trying to remember which one's the brother. So, of course, Cain and Abel are the two sons of Adam and Eve, and actually Cain was the firstborn, but he was a farmer, whereas his brother Abel was a shepherd, slightly associated a little more with blood, meat, animals, and the Lord liked Abel's offering more than Cain's, and Cain, in his jealousy, slew his brother, and was like, no, all the things are for me now. And God was like, hello, omniscient God, omniscient, omnipotent God, where is your brother? This didn't work out.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
He just ran away, it's fine. But in popular culture, characters like Cain have become like vampires. Like the children of Cain are the children of the first murder. And you look at the others that way, they are basically like ice vampires in a way.
Yeah, and I mean, Cain goes on to, live his life and have a son named Enoch and, like, make cities. He goes on to, like, figure shit out past this. But this is, of course, the first sin, or the first sin.
First murder.
Yeah. The first murder in this religious epic and story that we pass down in our real culture is that kinslaying. It is a brother against brother.
Mm-hmm.
Not an orgy of it, just one.
Well, just one this time, but I am sure in other religions they have orgies of kinslaying and brother against brother, because that's sort of how it goes. Another biblical example of this idea would be the idea of the prodigal son, where the dutiful brother, the one who does everything that his father asks of him, ends up feeling aggrieved because his ne'er-do-well brother who went away and came back is celebrated by his father. And although I'm not sure, I don't think there's any murder involved with the prodigal son story.
Murder.
No,
only
it is...
animals die. because we have
Only
a
animals
feast.
die, but it is the idea of somebody who is struggling with the idea that they think they've done everything right and they're not getting rewarded for it properly, much in the same way of Cain and Abel.
Yeah. And the prodigal son is pretty insulting. To ask for your father for, like, can I have my inheritance now, is basically saying, I wish you were dead. That's how it was in that culture.
Yeah.
But, it's a story of, this is what love is like, alright? Love is beautiful and heals things, and maybe if we loved people more and showed everyone love and that this is how love should be, maybe the brothers wouldn't kill each other, okay?
Although with the parallels between Cain and Abel, it's easy to that this is a long-running idea, at least in the Jewish and Catholic tradition, that people do feel aggrieved in the way that George is displaying in A Song of Ice and Fire.
Yes. And then we have other examples of, like, weird things going on with birthright in the Bible. Like, for example, there's a story of Isaac and Ishmael, and while what happens essentially is, it goes that Abraham is asked to bring one of his sons to be sacrificed because God has asked him to do so. And then an angel comes in and is like, "Whoa, hold up, we were just testing your faith. Alright, don't kill your son, let it go. We have a goat over there that we're still gonna sacrifice something. You're gonna sacrifice that goat." He's like, "This is awesome. I really love my son. I didn't want to kill him. He's the thing that I love or not thing, but I love him very, very much. One of the things that I love most in the world." And it's interesting because in real world faith, there's a difference in theology. In Judaism and Christianity, the belief is that the son that was asked to be sacrificed was Isaac.
Mm-hmm.
And in Islam, the belief is that the son was Ishmael.
Do you want to quickly explain the difference between the two sons?
I'm going to let you do that.
Okay, so the story was that Abraham and his wife Sarah, it's a plot that you would recognize from A Song of Ice and Fire probably. Abraham was having trouble having children with his wife Sarah, and although they prayed and asked God all the time for a child, it never came. So the idea came up that Abraham would instead have a child with their servant Hagar, and that was born Ishmael, the firstborn, but a bastard child, not one that was married to Abraham. Eventually, Sarah does get pregnant, as God always promised she would, and Isaac is born. And you have, again, a very A Song of Ice and Fire idea where the older brother is the bastard child, but he was firstborn. And then you have the trueborn child who's the secondborn. And how does that work out? And you end up with the differences in the faith between the Judaic traditions of Christianity and Judaism and the Muslim faith, which they split on, like you were saying, which son was the true heir of Abraham.
Yeah, exactly. And there are differences in interpretations of, like, there's the question of who gets the covenant, right, of God, and does it go with Isaac? Does it go with Ishmael? Ishmael, who with his mother Hagar, they were told, go out into the desert because Sarah didn't like the way that Ishmael and Hagar threatened what her son Isaac's inheritance might have been.
Mm-hmm.
So we see that play out, and then we see it again in the next generation, right, where Isaac has, I think it's the same Isaac. Okay, I am doing this right. And this plays out again in the next generation, this question of, like, who gets what? Because Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau, and Esau is the older brother. He's the masculine guy. He's the one who's, like, super hairy and, like, swole, and he's like, I'm going to get my father's blessing and carry out, like, God's will and shit. And then Jacob's like, I want it. So as Isaac is getting ready to give his blessing, there's, like, a whole ceremony and stuff. Jacob and his mother plot to steal it, and he puts on, I guess, like animal fur. He's like, look at me, I'm hairy. I mean, like, who's that hairy, alright? I guess Esau. Esau was that hairy that this worked. And Isaac was older and blind, and he's like, oh, this is my son, Esau, and gives the blessing to Jacob. And even though he said the word Esau, the blessing is given to Jacob. And then they're like, well, it's too late, we can't take it back. Jacob has stolen it. You're the second son has stolen it. Sorry, friends. And I mean, I guess...
I wish that's how the Bible was written. Just like that. Sorry, friends.
It kind of, like, works... I don't know that we would say, like, it definitely works out, but, like, you know, here we are. I guess. I don't know. Still talking about it. But, you know, this also... there are versions of this that echo in A Song of Ice and Fire.
Mm-hmm.
You're gonna have to go into this, because I don't know what this is.
Okay. So, hang on. Let me open it up.
Oh, you don't know what it is either. Great.
I like, kind of do. That particular story is echoed a little bit in the story of Huzor Amai, which is probably a mistranslation of the name Azor Ahai, the prophesied hero of the world, where he was somebody that should not inherit anything, but again, like we were talking about with Jacob, he ended up wearing the pelt of the king of the hairy men and made himself have the trappings of power, so he ended up taking the power anyway, even though he had no real right to it. Just like a little thing that tells you that George is paying attention to the Bible in these examples.
Yeah, it's not just that he's paying attention to these, like, these are things that these are the stories he grew up with, and these are the stories that many of us who, in Western culture, not Westerosi, literally Western culture in the real world, grow up with. These are the stories that echo throughout, and we even see this, you know, these aren't just stories in Christianity. You have these sorts of stories of infighting within the family in many other cultures, right? And I think what is so powerful about if George is channeling this in, like, Story of the Others, and obviously he's playing with this idea in the rest of A Song of Ice and Fire, and this idea of what does it mean to have a society where everyone is valued. Like, these are obviously things that, again, are universal. We all struggle with this. These are the stories that continue to captivate us after millennia, and George is really just tapping into something in that cultural ether.
Yes, and he's pulling it in. He's pulling these kind of large ideas within society and bringing them down and making it personal, and having his characters walk through these struggles and explore them, as he probably has in his own life, as we all have. And it would make sense that if you're talking about a story as broad as A Song of Ice and Fire that goes across so many different character arcs and stories, and just like the wide range that it is, it would make sense if they were all tied back to something simple like this. The idea of outsiders and the ideas of second sons and not getting what you think you deserve, and how do you deal with that?
Exactly. And this is obviously going to play a role in the rest of A Song of Ice and Fire. You know, George has talked about how there will be another dance of the dragons. We see Cersei does have some power. We see Euron rising in prominence in A Song of Ice and Fire, and, you know, obviously Ramsay Snow / Bolton is there in Winterfell, and, you know, we have Stannis up in the north, and all of these things are coming to meet each other, and it'll be interesting, like, who wins? Or maybe no one wins. Maybe everyone loses. All right. Maybe
everyone loses.
Yeah, that's why it's bittersweet. Everyone loses in a different way. But maybe if everyone loses, everyone wins. I don't know.
It's hard to say what he's going to do with the ending, but we know for, at least on the large scale, he is also playing with the ideas that we've been talking about. I think one of the best examples is the quote-unquote daughters of Valyria. The after Valyria fell, it was called the Century of Blood, where Pentos and Lys and Tyrosh and Volantis, all these Valyrian colonies, all tried to take their quote-unquote, well, I guess since they're the I'm not sure what gender you would give Valyria, but after it fell, who takes the inheritance? Who takes what used to be theirs? And you actually see that struggle play out, interestingly, between Aegon the Conqueror and Volantis, where he shows up with Balerion. They make an offer. No one's really sure what offer they made. Maybe they tried to steal Balerion. Who knows? But Aegon ends up burning their fleet and running home to be a conqueror. And just with like the idea of these daughters of Valyria, it at all levels it seems to be working.
Yeah. And then of course there's how the great sin of Valyria passes down through, I think, the rest of her children in those free cities, like that great sin of slavery, and also how it runs rampant throughout Essos, and that this may very well be what was the downfall of Valyria, because like in Westeros with Valyria, when you have a system that is built on that inequity, it pushes people to that edge that they are like, we will create our own power and seize it and try to take it, like as we were talking about with these bastards, cripples, and broken things. But we also see that with what may be the history of the Faceless Men, as they tell Arya, the Dragon Lords were cruel and they were forcing people to work in the mines until one day a slave promised that they would bring the gift of death to his master and to all of the masters. And that seems to very much be something that the Faceless Men... Never mind. And to all of the masters. Just cut
it. And like you're talking about with the Faceless Men, it appears much like, I think, like we see with like characters like Tyrion, where they had very good reasons for what they did, but Valyria is long gone and they're still going. And it could be the same for the others, where whatever the original sin was, whatever the initial conflict was that made them turn on their own kind, it's like 10,000 years in the past. But they're still going for it. They're still nursing that wound in a way that they probably should have let it go.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know if I should say that the Faceless Men should let it go, but like it's idea of that, like you said, nursing that power and that hate, and what happens when that hate hardens like ice and becomes something else entirely, something twisted and ugly and deadly.
I think the connection with the others and the Children of the Forest, I think, is probably the key to all of this, in that in a lot of George's other stories, he tells how races like the Children have trouble understanding humans, and that disconnect usually leads to lots of conflicts. And the Children may have created the others thinking like, oh, we can use humans against each other in sort of like a warlike way, and not understanding the depth of hatred and anger that humans are capable of, that they unleash something which we know from the story of the Pax and the Ends of the Long Night that basically happened, where they're like, whoops are bad, and help the humans take down the others. But that they unleashed and gave power to the worst parts of humanity would make sense.
Yeah, exactly, that they gave power to those worst parts, and they, like you said, didn't understand the hatred that could live in man's heart. For me, what I see is, like, speaking of George's other stories, in the story Sand Kings, where Simon gets these pets, and what he does is he has them fight against one another, and in so doing he has created them in his own image, shows them the worst parts of humanity and cruelty, because he becomes like a cruel god. And we learn later, again from Shade and Woe, later they're like, what did you do? Because if you had treated your Sand Kings well, like, look at my wonderful business partner here. Look, we are entrepreneurs. This was my pet, and now we have a business together. You too could have had 4 business partners. You could have had many business partners, but instead what you did was you taught your Sand Kings hate and cruelty, and they grew up in your image and became like that, and used that violence that you taught them to overthrow you.
Yeah. That could very easily be the story of the others in a transposed, much more... Simon Crest is kind of an over-the-top villain, in Sand Kings, it would make more sense if George made it more relatable and human, especially as he explores villains in a very different way through his POVs.
Yeah. Well,
woof.
This is good, right? We're done. I think we covered all of the things very in depth.
I think we went in depth here. I think we hit everything we wanted to. Okay. So that has been my first patron-only episode talking about Cripples, Bastards, and Broken Things. I hope you guys very much enjoyed our discussion. That was very wide-ranging, but I think you'll understand why this is the kind of thing I could not make into a shorter video. It's just too big a topic. There's too many different paths to go down for what I normally do, and I think this worked out pretty good.
Exactly, and this is something that Matt and I have been talking about for a while, so I think we're really excited to be able to share with all of you some of these ideas that he and I have been discussing and throwing around, and just put it out there.
Put it out there for you guys to enjoy. So yeah, like I said in the beginning, going forward, there will be more Patreon-only episodes like this. Not on this topic, obviously, different things, but this is what you can expect. Eliana, why don't you do some plugging of your things?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on here, Matt. I think the first thing that I'm going to plug is the thing that we do together. What?
What's that?
Well, so if you all enjoyed Matt and my banter here, you can hear Matt and I banter much more, regularly on the pseudo-monthly podcast, Maester Monthly, where again we talk about things that are going on in the fandom, especially what's hot in the subreddit and any particularly cool, neat things that we think that people should see that the community is discussing and doing, because we're all in this together.
It's true. And coming up with the show season, we'll probably be doing the episode recaps again, the Quill and Tankard style.
Yes, exactly. So keep an eye out for that. We have episodes coming out soon eventually. And you can also find me weekly on the Girls Gone Canon podcast, where we follow A Song of Ice and Fire through each character's POVs, all bunched up together.
Yeah.
And you can always find me on the Song of Ice and Fire subreddit, along with you may know Matt as AskJoeMagician there, and so you might know me as Glass Table Girl.
Yep, and we'll be posting more things there as we go on. Make sure you subscribe to all the things, not only to Eliana, but to me too. Obviously, there's my YouTube channel, the podcast feeds, and all those things, if you're not already. And share with your friends how awesome this patron-only episode was, because I think this was one of probably the best discussion I will be putting up on my content anywhere so far.
I thought you were going to say this was your best patron-only episode. And I was like, yeah, it is. It's your only patron-only episode.
Well, until now, more come out.
I know.
For now, it is the best of those. But, I think this is really in-depth and something that gets at the core of Song of Ice and Fire in a way I normally don't with my content. I usually talk about kind of extraneous things or magic or analysis. This is something that really gets to the core of what I think the story is about.
Yeah, this is about the magic of humanity, the dark magic that lives in all of our hearts, as well as the beautiful magic that love can do to a person's life.
Yeah, the love of Winterfell that can turn Jon into maybe somebody that will do horrible things. Hopefully not. The show seems to be going the other way, but it's set up that he might. Anyway.
Friendship is magic.
Also, just a reminder, since only people listening are patrons, fingers crossed, I think there's only... Unless people are giving out the link to people, in which case, piracy. Whoa, guys. Just kidding. Just reminder, if you're a $10 and up patron, you can, for my videos... Sanrixian produces those amazing pieces of art that I use for my slides on my videos. You can request for each new video one of those made for yourself with whatever you want written on it, and we'll give you a high quality PDF that you can do whatever you see fit with. So thanks you guys for listening. See you on the next patron only episode, and of course upcoming is the Pyre Daenerys thing that I'm doing with Bookshelf Stud, where we're going to be talking about the Targaryens and how they probably are seeing Daenerys in their dreams for hundreds of years. Anyway, thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.